Welcome back to our YouTube channel. What could be so terrible that it led to the complete destruction of two ancient cities by divine judgment? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a powerful tale of moral failure and its consequences. But what were the specific sins that led to their downfall? In this video, we'll dive into the 5 key transgressions that sealed the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah and why their story is still a vital lesson for us today. Stay tuned to uncover the profound warnings that this ancient narrative offers. The biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most dramatic accounts of divine judgment found in the Old Testament. The destruction of these cities is depicted as a direct consequence of their grave sins, which offended God so deeply that he decided to obliterate them with fire and brimstone. This narrative, found primarily in Genesis 18-19, has been the subject of extensive theological reflection and moral discourse throughout history. While the exact nature of the sins that led to their downfall is not enumerated in a single concise list, biblical texts and traditional interpretations have identified several key transgressions that were central to their destruction. 1. Sexual immorality. The sin most often associated with Sodom and Gomorrah is sexual immorality, particularly acts of violence and perversion. Genesis 19:1-11 recounts how 2 angels, disguised as men, visit Sodom and are taken in by Lot, the nephew of Abraham. The men of Sodom surround Lot's house and demand that he bring the visitors out so that they might know them. Genesis 19:5. The term "know" in this context is widely understood as a euphemism for sexual relations, and the men's demand is interpreted as a desire to commit sexual assault. This account is often cited as evidence of the city's depravity and serves as a focal point for discussions on sexual morality within the Judeo-Christian tradition. The attempted rape of the visitors is seen not just as a sin of lust, but as an act of extreme violence and violation, highlighting the deep moral corruption of the inhabitants. The narrative suggests that the people of Sodom had become so morally degraded that they were willing to engage in heinous acts of violence against strangers, showcasing their utter disregard for human dignity and sanctity. However, it's important to note that the focus on sexual immorality in the story of Sodom has been interpreted in various ways throughout history. While some traditions emphasize the act of homosexual rape as the central sin, others argue that the true sin was the city's propensity for violence and exploitation, with sexual immorality being one manifestation of this broader wickedness. 2. Inhospitality. In the ancient Near Eastern world, hospitality was not merely a social nicety, but a deeply ingrained cultural and religious obligation. Travelers and strangers were to be treated with respect and care, often as a reflection of one's devotion to God or gods. In this context, the behavior of the Sodomites towards Lot's guests represents a gross violation of this sacred duty. The story of Lot offering his daughters to the mob in place of his guests, Genesis 19:8, further illustrates the extreme value placed on protecting visitors, even to the point of sacrificing one's own family. While this act is itself morally troubling, it underscores the gravity of the sin of inhospitality in the eyes of the biblical authors. The people of Sodom not only failed to protect strangers, but actively sought to harm them, thus violating a fundamental principle of righteousness in their culture. The sin of inhospitality is often connected with broader themes of selfishness and indifference to others. By refusing to show hospitality, the people of Sodom displayed a lack of empathy and compassion, qualities that are central to the biblical understanding of justice and righteousness. This indifference to the well-being of others, especially the vulnerable, is a recurring theme in the prophetic literature of the Old Testament, where it is often linked with divine judgment. 3. Pride and arrogance. Pride is another sin closely associated with Sodom and Gomorrah. In Ezekiel 16:49-50, the prophet explicitly links the downfall of Sodom with the city's pride. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore I did away with them, as you have seen. This passage suggests that the people of Sodom were not just guilty of specific immoral acts, but had developed a general attitude of arrogance and self-sufficiency. They were overfed, implying a life of excess and luxury, and unconcerned, indicating a lack of care for those around them. This pride and self-indulgence led them to believe they were above reproach and not accountable to any higher moral or divine authority. In the biblical tradition, pride is often seen as the root of many other sins. It represents a turning away from God, a belief that one can live independently of divine guidance or moral constraints. The people of Sodom, in their pride, rejected the principles of justice, mercy, and humility that are central to the biblical worldview. Their destruction serves as a warning against the dangers of pride and the moral decay it can bring. 4. Social injustice. Closely related to the sins of pride and inhospitality is the sin of social injustice. Ezekiel's indictment of Sodom includes their failure to help the poor and needy. This lack of concern for social justice is another significant factor in their downfall. In the biblical narrative, justice is not merely a legal concept, but a fundamental aspect of righteousness. It involves ensuring that the vulnerable are protected and that the needs of the poor are met. The prophets frequently denounce societies that neglect the poor, exploit the weak, or fail to provide for those in need. In this context, the sin of Sodom can be seen as a systemic failure to uphold justice and care for the marginalized. The association of Sodom with social injustice is further reinforced by later Jewish and Christian interpretations, which often view the city's destruction as a judgment not just on individual acts of immorality, but on a society that had become fundamentally unjust. The story of Sodom serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of turning a blind eye to the needs of others and allowing injustice to flourish. 5. Idolatry. While the Genesis account does not explicitly mention idolatry as a sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, the broader biblical narrative suggests that idolatry, worshiping false gods or turning away from the true God, is often linked with moral and social decay. In the Old Testament, idolatry is frequently associated with a rejection of God's commandments and an embrace of behaviors that are contrary to God's will. Idolatry in Sodom can be inferred from their overall moral corruption. The people of Sodom had abandoned the worship of the true God, which would have included following his laws and principles. Instead, they pursued their own desires and created a society that was antithetical to the values of justice, mercy, and righteousness. In this sense, their idolatry was not just about worshiping false gods, but about placing their own interests and desires above God's will. The sin of idolatry is significant because it represents a fundamental breach of the covenant relationship between God and his people. In turning away from God, the people of Sodom effectively cut themselves off from the source of moral guidance and accountability. Their destruction can thus be seen as the inevitable consequence of their rejection of God and the moral order he established. Conclusion: the legacy of Sodom and Gomorrah. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is more than just a tale of divine wrath. It is a powerful moral lesson that has resonated through the ages. The sins of these cities, sexual immorality, inhospitality, pride, social injustice, and idolatry, are presented as a collective indictment of a society that had become deeply corrupt and estranged from God. These sins are not unique to Sodom and Gomorrah. They are temptations and failures that have plagued human societies throughout history. In the New Testament, Jesus refers to the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah as a cautionary example, Matthew 10:15, Luke 17:28-30, underscoring the idea that their destruction was not just about punishing sin, but about demonstrating the serious consequences of rejecting God's ways. The legacy of Sodom and Gomorrah thus continues to challenge believers to examine their own lives and societies, to ensure that they do not fall into the same patterns of behavior that led to the city's downfall. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah remains a powerful reminder of the importance of living in accordance with God's will, of practicing hospitality, justice, and humility, and of resisting the temptations of pride, selfishness, and moral compromise. It is a call to strive for righteousness in a world that often pulls us in the opposite direction, and to remember that the choices we make, individually and collectively, have profound consequences. As we've explored the 5 key sins that led to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's clear that this ancient story carries timeless lessons about morality, justice, and the consequences of turning away from what is right. The fate of these cities serves as a powerful reminder to examine our own actions and values, whether it's through the lens of personal integrity, social justice, or spiritual faithfulness. The warnings from Sodom and Gomorrah challenge us to live in a way that aligns with higher principles. Thank you for watching, and may this reflection inspire you to pursue a path of righteousness in your own life.